Welcome to Side Notes. I'm here at Out and About, Canadian Legion. Here's retired Major Mark Campbell. Thank you so much, Mark.
I'm glad to be here.
And you actually served from 1980, you reserve, 1986, you joined the Reg Force. What I'd like you to do is just go back in time, and what did it feel like to put the uniform on the first time?
I actually put the uniform on for the first time as an Army cadet, and I found the whole exercise kind of confusing because I wasn't really sure what badge went where and what sock was supposed to go on which foot and whether the colors and the toes were supposed to line up and all the rest of it. So my first experience in uniform was mixed fear that I got it wrong and a whole bunch of pride that, geez, I belong to an organization bigger than myself. Isn't this kind of neat?
And you went over to Cyprus and Bosnia. What's the difference between Cyprus and Bosnia and then your tours in Afghanistan? You did 2 tours in Afghanistan.
Yeah, my career arc just happened to coincide historically with a progression for the Canadian forces, at least for the Canadian Army, through traditional peacekeeping, which I participated in Cyprus in 1990. So we're on the green line. We have 2 opposing forces, Greek Cypriots, Turk Cypriots. They've agreed to disagree, but to stop fighting. So we were in the middle, and all we had to do was keep 2 sides that had already agreed to stop fighting from squabbling in the middle over little things. That progressed to peacemaking, peace support operations in Bosnia in 1997. At that point, we were forcing the Serbs to come to grips with the terms that had been agreed to in the Hague Conventions. And well, it was a 3-sided war, so it's unfair to single out the Serbs. All sides were guilty of atrocities. All sides were guilty of infractions of the Hague Accords. But it was the Serbians in particular that we had difficulty with at that point, and then the NATO bombing and all of that stuff. So we had this sort of peace enforcement. We're with NATO, we're not with the UN. We got guns, and we're going to make you do what we want you to do in the interests of global harmony. And then, of course, Afghanistan. And all of a sudden now, it started out as a bit of a conventional war. When I was there in 2002, we had the bad guys on the run. Al-Qaeda was on the run out of Afghanistan. The Taliban were in disarray. We went in there, and it was our job to muck out any last remnants of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Unfortunately, we were only able to muck so much, and then a good majority of them escaped across the border into Pakistan, including Osama bin Laden, as we now know. But that was kind of light infantry type, but conventional operation, pursuit operation. And then when I went back in 2008, after we'd gone into entered heavy combat in Kandahar in 2006, I found myself very much in a shooting war, but a particular type of shooting war, a counterinsurgency. And that's a particularly difficult and taxing type of military operation, type of warfare, simply because the enemy is ill-defined. You can't until they shoot at you. You can't tell an insurgent from a civilian. They're all dressed the same. Could be a farmer in the field, puts down his pitchfork, picks up an AK-47, starts bapping rounds at you. By the time you get close, the rifle's been put away or buried, and he's back to shoveling dirt.
So it's just like Vietnam.
Precisely, like the horror stories you heard of Vietnam. That's exactly what it was like, only with the added 21st century
arsenal
displeasure of the improvised explosive devices. Okay, and in Vietnam they had the punji pits, they had the occasional toe popper type mine or bouncing Betty, but not nearly the widespread use of explosives as both a weapon of attrition and a weapon of terror. We hadn't seen that before.
So can you actually take us to the day when you got hit by one of the explosives that the Taliban had?
Sure. Yeah, it was 2nd of June 2008. My job at the time was I was senior mentor for an Afghan Kandak, a battalion of about 500 Afghan infantry soldiers. I was out on a village clearance operation with one of the Afghan companies and one of my subordinate training teams. And we just finished clearing one village, and a Canadian platoon that was off to our right-hand side to protect our flank got into a significant firefight with a group of insurgents. And we were static in one location waiting to move on to the next village when we got a call on the radio from this platoon protecting our flank that they were in trouble. They had a Canadian sergeant had been shot. He was going into shock. He was going to die if they couldn't get him out. The only way to get him out is to have someone else take over the fight so that they could make a clean break and evacuate their wounded soldier by stretcher. So what that required was for us, as the only other nearby friendly force, to depart from what had been a very deliberate lockstep type operation with protection as much as possible. We then transitioned immediately, turned 90 degrees, and literally ran to the sound of the guns. Went from a deliberate operation into what we call a very hasty type of operation, an advanced enemy contact. We literally ran to the point where the guns were getting close enough. It was time to say, stop, let's go, let's stop for a second, get ourselves organized, because we are about to get into a gunfight. You don't want to run into a gunfight pell-mell, willy-nilly, for some pretty obvious reasons. So we did that. We upped and we turned 90 degrees, and we started steaming about 400 yards directly north of where we were, over hill and dale, through irrigation ditches and all the rest of it. Called the halt, and we were there for about 5 minutes. And I was sort of in the center where the headquarters normally locates itself, and I was talking on the radio and looking at my map, getting ready to move off again into the fight. And I came around a wall to talk to rejoin my headquarters, and as I was crossing an area in front of this wall that dozens of soldiers had already walked over that within the preceding 5 minutes, boom, up I went. And then what it was I was targeted by a command-detonated IED, and the bad guys had waited, seeing that I was leadership, had waited until I came in the vicinity of their bomb, and in fact was standing directly on top of it with my left foot when they detonated the bomb. So I have clear recollection of everything going orange, heat on my backside, flying through the air and landing on my back with a big whoomp, and my armor plate came crashing down and kind of knocked the wind out of me. So I was a bit stunned, I was disoriented, my eyes were full of dirt, which was quickly turning to mud with the sweat, and I wasn't sure what had happened. My first thought was RPG. Somebody, a rocket-propelled grenade had been fired into the middle of my headquarters and blown us all apart. I tried to sit up. My left leg came up. There was nothing there, just above the knee, except my femoral artery spurting blood, good 2-3 feet. My right leg was hanging on by a few threads just below the knee. That femoral artery was also going, so I knew I only had a couple minutes to live, if that. So at the same time I was blowing up, what the enemy did was launch a 3-sided ambush at us, right? And so there's rocket-propelled grenades whistling around and exploding all over the place, and bullets flying everywhere. And I yelled over the din of that, guys, I'm hit, I need a hand. And to their credit, Canadian soldiers from both sides of me, under fire, got up, crossed, dangerous ground, got down under cover and started putting the tourniquets on me. With 2 tourniquets on each leg, they were able to staunch the flow of blood, to slow it down enough to a trickle. They dragged me out of the line of fire under cover where my medic could do some more work on me to look for additional serious injuries. I did have quite a few other additional serious injuries besides left leg, right leg. They just weren't apparent at the time because this was so overwhelming, not just for myself, but for the people treating me. Everybody always focuses on the worst visible injury, often to the neglect of injuries that end up actually killing the person. In any case, in my case, that wasn't what happened. I was starting to die. I was starting to tank out due to low blood pressure. So my medic saved my life by giving me a unit of what they call rescue flow, which is a blood expander, tricks the body into thinking the blood pressure's back to normal. At that point, we entered about a 90-minute running gun battle over hill and dale back to an area where we could bring in a helicopter, safely bring in a helicopter to evacuate not just myself, but 4 other casualties from that same explosion. And once the helicopter arrived, I knew I had 30 minutes left that I had to stay alert, stay alive for the flight back to Kandahar. Once we got to Kandahar airfield, they whistled me into the surgical hospital. Because I was awake, they insisted on playing the how many fingers game, which I was really upset about. But I played their game, and then they put me out. I promptly died on the operating table. They brought me back with their paddles for my sins. Spent about a week in an induced coma in Kandahar. Went to Germany for 2 weeks. Almost died there again of a cardiopulmonary embolism in the ICU. They managed to save me. Again, my family flew over because the Canadian leadership weren't convinced that I was going to survive the event, make it back to Canada. As it stood, I spent 2 weeks in Germany. I did stabilize enough for a return to Canada. Came back to Canada, spent 2 months in the University of Alberta Hospital undergoing well over a dozen surgeries on my legs. Spent another 2 months following that in the rehabilitation hospital, Glen Rose Rehab Hospital in Edmonton. Tried to learn to use prosthetics. They wouldn't work with my left leg. It's just too messed up. So I learned wheelchair skills, among other things. So and after that, I was done. I was out in the street as a disabled veteran.
And I know after you're talking tonight how hard it's been on your family. So what I'd like you to share is that some of the stuff not only your wife has gone through, but even your children. You have young children.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, as I mentioned this evening, I mean the challenge was significant. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. Losing your legs at 43 years of age, along with a bunch of other injuries in the groin area that any man can well imagine. Let's just say it's your worst nightmare. You know, ruptured right eardrum, PTSD, major depressive disorder, also all those good gifts I have, you know, they cost me personally. I started to self-medicate with alcohol and all the rest of it. I had to go off to rehab, do all those things in order to arrive where I am 5 years later, reasonably sane, you know, and fairly healthy. My family, if you think it was hard on me, man oh man, it was devastating to my family members. My wife, I explained this evening, due to the pressures of dealing with an unresponsive, bureaucratic, bloated red tape system, both the Canadian Forces and Veterans Affairs, it brought her to the point of mental illness. She had a nervous breakdown, and to this day, my wife is medicated, cannot work. You know, that was 1/3 of my family's income disappeared when she lost her ability to work. And ironically, she was a warrant officer serving in the Canadian Armed Forces as a resource management clerk when all of this transpired. So she was actually medically released from the Canadian Armed Forces as being unfit for service, and yet she was denied disability compensation because the determination was that her mental illness was not a result of her military duty, but of being married to an injured military member. That's neither here nor there. We're battling that on through the military chain. For my children, just as devastating, I would argue. My son, he was 11 years old. He saw his superhero dashed in front of his eyes, literally. The next time he saw me, after I was marching off to war, looking smart in my uniform, he saw half a dad lying in a hospital bed with dozens of tubes coming out of him. Pretty devastating for an 11-year-old boy to see his personal hero knocked down. So it had a huge lasting hit, I believe, on my son's self-esteem and self-confidence. He's still struggling. He's supposed to graduate high school this year. We're a couple weeks away and we still don't know if he's going to make the cut. It's that bad. He was a straight A student when I was hit. And after that it was just downhill. My daughter, on the surface, she seems more resilient than my son. She was only 8 years old when I was hit. She was a little, she was young enough to understand that Dad was hurt and Dad was hurt bad, but a lot of it went over her head, which is just as well. And she's just my son's more the sensitive type, my daughter's more the resilient type, the outgoing, the forceful type, the fighter type. So it seems to have affected her to a lesser extent on the surface, but my wife has told me, talking to our daughter, she won't confide in me necessarily, but she's confided in her mother that she still thinks about it often and it affects her. I mean, she sees me every day and the state I'm in, so obviously it's affected her.
And you got the new Veterans Charter. They gave you $276,000 for a lump sum. How has that affected you? And what, I know you're in the court system right now. You're trying to battle for yourself, and there's a couple other younger veterans.
Yeah.
How does that affect you, and what is the thing that you guys want to win out of the court decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. The $250,000 lump sum, that was gone before I was even out of the hospital. I had to buy a minivan if I was going to have a ramp van and have my independence. Okay, well, there's only two companies that do the ramp van conversions in North America, and they both demand new vehicles to do the conversions on. So right from my hospital bed, right off the bat, given the lead time, I had to order up a van. Literally, while I was still undergoing my first few surgeries, my wife had to get on and spend $32,000 on a brand new minivan. Then the next thing that happens is the occupational therapist goes to my home and determines that this house that I own is not suitable, advantageously suitable for renovation. Therefore, you're going to have to build a new home, Mr. Campbell. So the balance of my $276,000, the other $240,000, went towards a $285,000 lot of land that I needed in order to build a wheelchair accessible home. Building the wheelchair accessible home, there was no new home construction policy existing in the Canadian Forces at the time. I was the guinea pig, so I got to carry 2 mortgages for a year and a half, serve ramen noodles to the kids, and do all those good penny pinching things just like any other Canadian would, having to build a house on top of existing ownership, carrying 2 mortgages. So that was pretty painful. And if it weren't for a very timely, small inheritance, we might or might not have made it, you know, financially, my wife and I. And I was a senior major, so imagine how a junior corporal makes out when this happens to him. And the answer is, not particularly well. Not particularly well. My concern is for my own family. I'm not gonna sugarcoat that. Absolutely, that's first and foremost my responsibility is to my wife and my children. But beyond that, I'm extremely concerned about the junior soldiers, the junior disabled soldiers, and soon-to-be disabled veterans, the ones that are going to be released from the forces given the severity of their injuries. One, a lot of them can't defend themselves or fight for their own rights. A lot of them are PTSD shut-ins who can't leave their parents' basements. A lot of them just don't have the wherewithal and the self-confidence to come forward and speak on their own behalf. I worry about the young guys because the youngest of them, the corporals, are going to be capped at $40,000 earnings for the rest of their life, indexed at 2%. That's it. How can you hope to raise a family and send your children to secondary, post-secondary education on $40,000 a year when it's this far above the low-income cutoff for Canadian families? And that is the plight of our junior soldiers. The vast majority of our wounded are junior soldiers. That's what concerns me. Me personally, even with the new Veterans Charter, given my seniority, given my years of experience, based on the new Veterans Charter and the model they have, financially, I will be disadvantaged as compared to the salary I was earning while I was serving, and that's the basis of the lawsuit. Why should disabled Canadian veterans be the only class of Canadian citizen guaranteed to have a lower standard of living based on a lower income as a direct result of a workplace injury, let alone a significant sacrifice on behalf of the nation? So my concern is the young guys predominantly, but yeah, I'm concerned about my own family, and who wouldn't be?
What was your first time that you actually found out what the new Veterans Charter was? Being a senior officer, you know, one would think that you would actually have some possible hindsight into it, but when you actually found out what it was, what was your first thought?
Oh, it was dawning horror. It was like a slowly unfolding slow motion car crash that you happened to be the middle of, the star of the feature. I was still lying in my hospital bed watching my left leg get shorter by an inch every day as they cut back the bone to get viable tissue to cover the end of the femur. Meanwhile, as VAC's throwing forms at me to fill out and sign, I've got this slowly dawning realization, this horror in the pit of my stomach, that not only am I physically in big trouble, but at the same time, the government has seen fit in the middle of the war to financially screw me on disability compensation at the same time. So talk about your double whammy, or your insult added to injury. I mean, it was huge. As a senior officer, should I have known what the new Veterans Charter entailed? Absolutely not. And the reason not is there's been no education process in the Canadian Armed Forces from then to now. I know this to be a fact. There has been no formal education process to inform Canadian soldiers that their disability compensation for on-duty or active duty disability has been reduced 30 to 90% across the board depending on your terms of service. They don't know that. They still don't know that. I know because I did informal sampling all across the ranks from private to lieutenant colonel last summer during a series of unit changes of command. And I asked the question. And the vast majority still believe they're going to get a tax-free medical pension plus their military pension, and they're going to live, you know, reasonably comfortably. Well, the fact of the matter is, the truth, as I discovered when I was in that situation myself, is that is not the case. That is not the case at all. There is no medical pension. It's gone. They took it away. That's what the lump sum is all about. That lump sum, that $276,000 that I got, for pain and suffering, not for the physical loss of the limbs or the other injuries that they didn't even include, because 125,000, 125,000. Sorry, Mr. Campbell, you're done. Left leg, right leg. We don't care about any of your other injuries because we don't have the money to pay you for them. You know, to find out that I wasn't going to be compensated, to find out that $250,000 is supposed to compensate not just me, but my wife and children for the pain and suffering and the loss of opportunity and enjoyment associated with me not having legs. You know, so $250,000 or $275,000, would that satisfy you to lose your legs? Is that going to cover your family's pain and suffering for the balance of your life, plus their own lives as survivors?
That wouldn't even come close. The organization you guys are going underneath to do this lawsuit, I think it's called Equitas.
Equitas, yes.
It's, is there a website that people can actually go to? I know that the lawyers are doing it pro bono, but there's other expenses. Maybe people want to donate some money to help it.
And the Equitas Society, just so people understand, that the Equitas Society was formed as the fundraising arm of the class action lawsuit. The lawsuit belongs to myself as one of the 6 representative plaintiffs and the other 5 plaintiffs, and that's who the lawyers work for pro bono. What Equitas and the Equitas Society is there to do is to raise funds to pay the disbursements. Disbursements being the sort of the fees that don't fall, or the costs of doing a court case that don't fall under pro bono, not specific to the lawyer's time. In other words, travel for witnesses, travel for the plaintiffs, the costs of providing medical evidence, the costs of bringing in medical experts to testify, expert testimony. Those are disbursement costs. And that's what the Equitas Society is raising funds to pay. So the Equitas Society welcomes any donations. The website is simply equitassociety.ca, all one word, EQUITASSOCIETY.ca, equitassociety.ca. If you go there, all of the background is there. Everything you need to understand the lawsuit, where the lawsuit stands, why we're conducting the lawsuit, it's all there. And I would have to say, and I didn't have a hand in it or a role in it, that the website is well laid out, it's easy to navigate, it's easy to understand, and it is an excellent, probably the best primer that you're going to get on the new Veterans Charter, that despite the fact it's part of the lawsuit, is as neutral as you're ever going to see. It's certainly more neutral than the propaganda you're going to get out of Veterans Affairs.
Well, I'd like to say that you are a very inspirational person. And looking back over everything you've been through in the military, after the service, even before you joined, are there any words that you want to share with people?
Yeah, I guess the one thing I would say is that despite what happened to me, despite my injuries, despite the current legal entanglements that I'm involved in, I really don't have any regrets up until the point I was blown up. I have great regrets after the fact, particularly because of the impact on my family of what happened to me, but I have no regrets about choosing a career of service to Canada. And I guess my point would be to encourage anyone who's watching, to find a way to serve your country. There is no higher calling, no more honorable calling or profession than to serve your country. And I don't necessarily mean in a military fashion. There's political service, there's community service at the municipal, provincial, federal levels. There's all kinds of ways to serve. My point is, find a way to serve. It's rewarding.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.